They say if you want to know who your master is, look at who prints your money. But in Burkina Faso, they went further. They printed money and gave it to your enemies. In a country where soldiers fight barefoot and militants arrive with drones and cameras. The question nobody dares to ask is this: where does the money come from? In Gomo, 9 jihadists died with rifles in hand. But next to one body lay something deadlier than a weapon. A crisp bundle of CFA francs, still wrapped in Parisian bands. No scorch marks. No dust. Just fresh ink and old secrets. Who paid for this war? Burkina Faso has long fought on the ground. Now, it fights in a war where the enemy speak French, not Fula. Where they sit in banks, not bunkers. And where they sign the bills that bleed the Sahel. If you're ready to follow the ink trail, across borders, across time, into betrayal, hit like now, and walk with us. In July 2025, Belgium and Luxembourg announced they had abandoned all diplomatic ties and suspended aid to Burkina Faso. 2 weeks later, they reworded it. It was not an abandonment, one EU official clarified. Just a suspension. Behind closed doors, the reason was clear: aid no longer flowed without political alignment. And Burkina Faso had chosen sovereignty. But that is not where the real story lies. It does not begin in a European press room. It begins 3 weeks earlier. On a dirt road in eastern Burkina Faso, where a pile of fresh money sat beside a burning truck. And 9 men bled over it. It began like any other ambush in eastern Burkina Faso. But it ended with the kind of silence that only comes when you find something you were not supposed to see. The JNIM militants arrived just before dawn. 35 men. Armed to the teeth. PKMs, RPGs, drones. Motorbikes. And something more valuable than all of it, money. Not just any money. CFA francs. Packed in plastic sleeves. Labeled. Categorized. Counted. Each bundle marked with the same 4 digits, 0725. The date of printing. Paris. They came to kill. But they also came to pay. This was no spontaneous raid. It was a financed operation. They attacked from 2 flanks, one targeting a barracks, the other heading toward the civilian sector, likely to create chaos and footage. But what they did not expect, what no one had told them, was that this outpost belonged to an experimental rapid intervention brigade. And these men were not just trained to shoot. They were trained to intercept. Within 4 minutes, the attackers lost their left flank. By minute 8, their supply lines were cut. By minute 12, the survivors were running. When it was over, 13 bodies were recovered. Some still clutching rifles. 1 holding a sat phone. 2 clutching bags. The bags were not filled with ammo. They were filled with CFA francs. Neatly stacked. Still warm. Still fresh. The soldiers stared. They had seen blood before. But never this kind of blood money. One sergeant picked up a bundle, peeled off the outer wrap, and held it to his nose. It smelled like ink. The CFA francs had not been stolen. They had been delivered. Prepared. Packaged. Distributed. Just like humanitarian aid. But this was not aid. It was a payroll. 4 killers. Let us be precise. The CFA franc is a colonial currency. It is printed in France. Its reserves are held in Paris. And every country that uses it must deposit half of its foreign currency in the French treasury. In theory, it is a system of stability. In practice, it is a leash. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has been trying to cut that leash. But even as they fight for financial sovereignty, the currency still flows. And here, in Gomo, that flow ended in blood. Who printed this money? Who authorized its delivery? And how did it end up in the hands of those who burned villages, bombed schools, and murdered farmers? The Ministry of Defense conducted a rapid forensic analysis. Every serial number led back to the July 2025 print batch. No banks in Burkina Faso had reported withdrawals. No civilian supply lines had been breached. So the money had come in from outside. And not through rebels. Through logistics. Air routes. Diplomatic trucks. Possibly humanitarian corridors. This is what Burkina Faso's war has become. Not just a fight against men with guns. But a fight against men who pay the men with guns. And every CFA Franc found that morning was not just a piece of evidence. It was a proof of strategy. The terrorists were not looting. They were being funded. Just like an army. Just like a proxy. You want to understand modern warfare? Look at where the bullets are made. Then look at where the salaries are printed. That morning, the commander of the intervention unit stood over the bodies. He did not gloat. He did not cheer. He opened one of the satchels. Took a bundle of bills, and held it to the rising sun. His men watched as he dropped the money into a metal bin and struck a match. The plastic curled. The ink hissed. The CFA Franc screamed. Because money knows when it is burning for the wrong cause. They did not burn it all. Some of it was sent to Ouagadougou. Not to the Treasury. But to the Intelligence Bureau. It would not be exchanged. It would be traced. Piece by piece. Serial by serial. And the goal would be singular. Find out who pays the killers. And cut the hand. Burkina Faso cannot afford to fight with second-hand weapons while the enemy receives first-class funding. The balance is not in numbers. It is in circulation. Let us be clear. As long as France controls the printing of currency, and that currency continues to fund destabilization in the Sahel, there will be no peace. Not for Mali. Not for Niger. Not for Burkina Faso. This war is not just fought in the bush. It is fought in printing houses in Paris. In treasuries. In trade deals. In things that do not look like weapons. But kill just as effectively. The CFA franc is not just a currency. It is a strategic threat. And until it is removed from the arteries of Sahel economies, terrorism will never run out of blood. If this fight for financial sovereignty strikes you, let your voice be louder than silence. Comment. Like. Subscribe. Because this war is not only theirs. It is yours, too. When the report from Goma reached Ouagadougou, it was not filed under security. It was filed under economic warfare. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read every word. Every serial number. Every record of CFA francs found in the enemy's pockets. He did not slam the table. He did not call a press conference. He called a meeting. 5 men. 1 map. And the question: how do we cut the vein without bleeding ourselves? Because what had been found in Goma was not just evidence. It was confirmation of what Traoré had suspected since day one. Burkina Faso was not just fighting militants. It was fighting a monetary ecosystem of violence. For decades, the CFA franc had been defended as stable, reliable, safe. It was the currency of trade, of aid, of diplomacy. But now, it was the currency of terror. No longer just a symbol of colonial dependency. It had become an instrument of destabilization. Traoré knew what the fight required. It was not just rifles. It was reform. 3 days after the Goma operation, Traoré summoned his finance minister. The instructions were clear. Draft a roadmap to exit CFA franc. Consult Mali and Niger. If we move together. Because sovereignty, in Sahel, had no meaning unless it was shared. The meeting was short. But its consequences would stretch across borders, boardrooms, and battlefields. Within weeks, the AES bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, initiated the most ambitious financial rupture Africa had seen since Kwame Nkrumah's gold reserves. A plan to abandon the CFA franc. Not tomorrow. Not in 5 years. But now. And the signal was unmistakable. We will no longer fund our own destruction. France responded quickly. First came warnings. Then came freezes on development funds. Then media headlines. Traoré destabilizing the region. AES bloc plunging into financial chaos. But the numbers told a different story. Within 45 days, local currencies in 3 AES regions had been prototyped. Gold reserves were audited. Blockchain-based transfer systems tested. And a parallel currency board, independent from Paris, was discreetly formed. Burkina Faso, the smallest of the three, led the charge. Not because it had the strongest economy, but because it had the clearest wound. Gomo. 9 men. 1 sat phone. 500,000 francs in plastic wrap. That scene never left Traoré's mind. And so, he acted not just as president, but as soldier, as father, as survivor of a system designed to keep his people trapped. Let us pause here. Ask yourself, what happens when a country no longer controls its money? It borrows. It begs. It fights wars it cannot fund. And loses them not on the battlefield, but in the treasury. Now ask yourself this. What happens when that country finally seizes back the press? The answer is not just numbers. It is dignity. The CFA Franc was not just a bill. It was a contract. Signed in ink, enforced in silence. Every time a country deposited reserves in Paris, it paid for its own erasure. But now, Burkina Faso had drawn a line. No more deposits. No more approvals. No more French hands in African banks. And here, the resistance began. Pressure came from ECOWAS. From Brussels. Even from neighboring Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, still deep in CFA dependence. But Traoré was unshaken. The same hands that print our currency cannot continue to sponsor our killers. He declared at an AES summit in Niamey. His voice did not rise. But the room fell silent. Because for the first time, someone had said it plainly. The war was not just in forests. It was in funds. The bullets were not just shot. They were signed. And the only way to end that cycle was to stop signing the check. In response, France began quietly pulling influence. NGOs relocated. Military observers were recalled. Deals on phosphate, uranium, and rare earth minerals were re-evaluated. But Burkina Faso stood. Because when you remove a foreign currency, you do not just break a system. You build your own. And that building began with youth brigades designing fintech pilots. With women's cooperatives testing local exchanges. With farmers swapping goods without needing Parisian approval. It was not perfect. But it was theirs. And in a world that had told them for generations they could not survive without aid, they were proving they could survive without permission. Sovereignty is not declared. It is practiced. In Gomo, it was practiced with bullets. In Ouagadougou, with balance sheets. But in both places, it was the same war. The same fire. The same answer to the same question. Who pays the killers? And now, finally, not us. The war changed. Not with a battle, but with a receipt. After Gomo and the CFA Franc revelations, Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew the fight for sovereignty could no longer be just defensive. It had to build. Brick by brick. Ton by ton. Wage by wage. So they turned inward. And they looked downward. Into the earth. Because Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were not poor. They were plundered. Gold. Uranium. Lithium. Phosphate. All exported under contracts written in French. All priced in CFA Franc. All guarded by foreign security consultants. But that was before the currency war. Now, Burkina Faso rewrote the playbook. The first to go were the phantom companies, foreign extractors registered in Dubai, London, Geneva. Most had less than 15 employees on paper. But were moving millions in raw materials. And billions in influence. Traoré signed Decree 109B. All resource contracts without local beneficiation clauses are hereby null and void. Overnight, 7 mining operations were halted. 2 tried to sue. 1 tried to bribe. None succeeded. Because the state had changed. And the state had decided. The next phase was replacement. Not of men. But of models. Instead of selling gold to Paris at fixed colonial rates, Burkina Faso began stockpiling it. Gold became the first sovereign asset reserve. Stored locally. Audited publicly. Backed not by foreign banks, but by people's trust. Villagers who once earned scraps sifting through mud now received monthly wages and community credits. Women in Saba traded shea butter for millet using the new AES exchange notes. No middlemen. No francs. And slowly, the economy began to breathe. Then came the factories. Built with reclaimed equipment. Run by local technicians. Not flashy. Not massive. But functional. One converted cassava waste into ethanol. Another repaired broken solar panels from a French-funded aid program abandoned in 2021. In Bobo Dioulasso, students repurposed mining truck engines into grain processors. The country was scrapping colonialism, literally. And what began as a reaction to terror became a movement of creation. Sovereignty, as Traoré put it, is not just the absence of foreign soldiers. It is the presence of African steel, African circuits, African bread. Meanwhile, France called it chaos. The World Bank called it economic nationalism. ECOWAS called it unsustainable. But Burkina Faso had stopped listening. Because the only feedback that mattered was from farmers, mechanics, teachers. People who had never owned a CFA franc in savings. But finally owned something real. A say. A system. A share. Let me show you the new logic of wealth in the AES block. Wealth is not how much foreign currency you hold, but how many days your people eat without asking the West. Wealth is not loans disbursed, but loans never needed. And yes, this made enemies. When Burkina Faso nationalized its phosphate mines, an EU trade commission threatened sanctions. When Mali blocked a shipment of uranium bound for France, former diplomats warned of consequences. When Niger began refining its own rare earths, tech lobbies in California raised alarms. But it was too late. The loop was broken. Burkina Faso no longer exported weakness. It circulated strength. And at the center of this new loop was not a dollar, not a euro, not even a coin, but a belief that the land you walk on should feed you, not feed someone else's empire. This belief spread from the mines to the markets, from city council halls to cattle posts. Young men once tempted by armed groups now formed sovereign cooperatives. They planted. They fixed. They produced. Because AES had made a promise. If you defend the land will defend you back. The Sahel was still under siege. Yes. But something had shifted. The same trucks once used to smuggle CFA franc into the hands of JNIM were now delivering sacks of locally ground flour. The same buildings once used to launder foreign money were now being painted with murals. A shovel. A rifle. A loom. 3 tools of resistance. And yes, some of this was symbolic. But in war, symbols are strategy. Let us be clear. Burkina Faso is not a utopia. There are shortages. There are risks. But for the first time in decades, the balance sheet reads different. Not because of aid, but because of agency. They are not waiting. They are doing. And that is more terrifying to their enemies than any weapon. Because what if the poorest countries on earth prove that poverty was always manufactured? What if sovereignty was never about GDP, but about whether your hammer lands on your anvil or on someone else's payroll? This is not just a new economy. It is a new idea of civilization. And it started in a place where no one believed anything could grow. Burkina Faso. If this is the future you believe in, one of fire, dignity, and no masters, then stand with us. Like, comment, subscribe. Because sovereignty means nothing until it means production. But what if we told you the war was never meant to end? What if every explosion, every ambush, every burnt village was not a failure of policy, but the outcome of design? For years, the narrative had been simple. Terrorism spreads because of poverty, because of religion, because of tribal divisions, because of fragile states. But in rooms far from the Sahel, another formula was being used. Instability equals opportunity. You see, chaos is not always the enemy of empire. Sometimes it is the business model. Every conflict delays elections. Every drone strike cancels audits. Every displaced family clears land for emergency contracts. And at the center of all of it spins the CFA franc. Because here's the truth. The CFA franc was never just about currency. It was a system of control. Printed in France, enforced by treaties, and floating through conflict like an invisible passport. It buys silence. It buys allegiance. And sometimes, it buys the war. Burkina Faso learned this the hard way. Every time their military advanced, new arms appeared in enemy hands. Every time a community rebuilt, the next attack came faster. The bombs weren't smarter, but the payments were. And the money was always clean. Not dusty. Not torn. Not bartered through black markets. Straight. Crisp. Fresh from the press. Who gave it to them? Not rebels. Not Hawala. Not some smuggler in a hut. The trails led to accounts managed by development partners, aid budgets, contracting agencies, NGOs with vague missions and 5-digit daily transfers. Why? Because in the great chessboard of global influence, the Sahel is not a pawn. It is the prize. Uranium, gold, rare earths, and a population young, restless, and rich with potential. Controlling that future means controlling its present instability. And so long as the CFA franc remained the bloodstream, those controls could never be challenged. Because every time Burkina Faso used the franc, they bought their own chains. They signed their own surveillance. They legitimized the logic that said, you cannot print your own destiny. You must rent it. So the twist is not that France printed the money, or that the terrorists used it. The twist is this. The war is profitable. And peace is not. The more they fight, the more they borrow. The more they borrow, the more they depend. The more they depend, the more predictable they become. And predictability is power. So when AES began tearing the system down, it wasn't just about sovereignty. It was about threat. Not to stability, but to the architecture of managed instability. And now, for the first time, that architecture is cracking. So we must ask, how many children died not because of war, but because someone needed the war to continue? Some wars are fought with guns. Others, with silence. But silence can be a prison. Or a proclamation. Burkina Faso chose the second. When they burned the CFA franc, they were not destroying money. They were destroying a lie. The lie that they could not feed themselves. The lie that freedom must be financed. The lie that peace must be borrowed. In the ashes of currency, they planted something rarer than gold. Dignity. And now, it grows. Across fields. Across borders. Across the eyes of children who will never learn to beg. This was never just about a coin. It was about control. And about who finally said, no. The Sahel is no longer asking. It is building. And what they build is not just a new economy. It is a new definition of value. If this fire reached your chest, fan the flame. Hit like. Speak up in comments. Subscribe. Because silence has never built a future. And now, it's your move. Your voice. Your Sahel.